Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Thanks for sending us your emails at keiserreport@rttv.ru. I read some of them. And you know, you people are concerned out there, and rightfully so, because the global economy is being held hostage by the global kleptocracy that's meeting this week in Davos to talk about all of the ways they're going to totally screw the global economy some more and steal more money, because that's what they're best doing at, or something like that. I better get Stacy Herbert in here to help me sort out my syntax. Stacy?
Max, actually, speaking of syntax, pronunciation is in my first headline story. More Icelandic bankers arrested. So while all the global bankers are meeting in Davos, Switzerland this week, unreported in the mainstream media that there has been more arrests in Iceland, but you can't pronounce any of the guys' names. So of course, if you can't pronounce their names, have these bankers been arrested?
Banker Jones Dottir. A. Banker Jones Dottir. B.
Well, actually, one of the arrested parties in Iceland is the former Landsbanki treasury boss, John Thorstein Idolleifsson. But yes, okay, so the Iceland special prosecutor into the banking crisis has confirmed the raids have taken place and arrests have been made. The Central Bank of Iceland is among the institutions under investigation. In particular, these arrests in the past week involve a $300 million loan made by Landsbanki on October 6, 2008, the day emergency law was enacted in Iceland, and the day before the bank Landsbanki was taken over by the Financial Services Authority.
Yeah. That's right. Icelandic banks were the first into the global collapse due to the fraud perpetrated by the bankers, and they had to shut them down. They shut those banks down, something that Irish government has not done, or the Greece government has not done, the Greek government has not done, which they should do, because Iceland is taking the right action. They've shut down the banks, and now they're looking for those bankers, and they're going to string them up by their thumbs, and they're going to beat them to within an inch of their life.
Well, I don't know about that, but they're certainly arrested. And it makes me wonder why all these bankers from all the major banks in the U.S., all the investment banks around the world, are in Switzerland this week. And we know Switzerland has been executing arrest warrants for all sorts of people around the world. Perhaps we could get them to arrest some of these bankers in Switzerland at the moment. But because they haven't, we're going to look at some headlines which we'll see more of, because no bankers around the world who have perpetrated this great financial crime are allowed to roam freely. First headline, Tunisia's central bank admits it is missing 1.5 tons of gold.
Uh-oh.
So as we've been reporting, of course, Tunisian President Ben Ali fled the country, but he took 24% of the nation's gold supply. Notice that he didn't take 24% of the nation's US dollar supply.
No, only gold is money, and they know that.
Also, according to Egypt News, the country's airport has intercepted 59 shipments of gold directed for the Netherlands worth tens of millions of dollars.
That's me. I ordered that gold.
It could be somebody rich in Egypt getting ready for the collapse of the Mubarak regime, just as in Tunisia, and just as possibly upcoming in Yemen or any of these other dictatorships supported by the U.S.
Well, I think it's interesting that as the dictators flee the countries, they're taking their gold with them. And a lot of countries now are looking at their gold reserves to find out if they're really there. As we reported on our show, 60% of Germany's gold reserves are held in the United States. They're held at the New York Fed. And there's already talk in the U.S. of commandeering Germany's gold and putting it into a secure military facility. And then you've got Fort Knox in the U.S. They haven't been audited for decades. Presumably they have 8,000 tons of gold, but based on what you're saying here, when the kleptocrats and the dictators run out of the U.S., the George W. Bushes of the world and all the folks that ransacked, raped, and pillaged the American economy, who's to say that they already haven't stolen much of that gold and it's in Paraguay somewhere on Bush's huge ranch down there?
Let's move on to the U.S. Federal Reserve, who is supposedly overseeing some of this gold. Accounting tweak could save Fed from losses. Well, concerns that the Federal Reserve could suffer losses on its massive bond holdings may have driven the central bank to adopt a little-noticed accounting change with huge implications. It makes insolvency much less likely, because the change essentially allows the Fed to denote losses by the various regional reserve banks that make up the Fed system as a liability to the Treasury, i.e. the taxpayer, rather than a hit to its capital.
Well, this is just more Ponzi scheme financing. They studied their accounting methodology at Bernie Madoff University. So now you've got the Fed and the Treasury, Bernanke and Geithner, talking to each other and exchanging phantom lots of currencies. As I've explained on this show before, most of what happens on Wall Street are just two corrupt bankers writing on cocktail napkins in lipstick that they borrowed from some overpriced hooker, $20 billion, and exchanging that back and forth and charging a fee. And then those fees, the only way they can be paid when the banks go out of business is for the government, who's been co-opted, to extort the money from the general population. And that's the American banking system and the global banking system coming to the entire world vis-a-vis what they're talking about at Davos. I don't know if you're covering this or not, but Davos, they're talking about instituting $100 trillion of new debt. That's $100 trillion of worthless cocktail napkins with smeared lipsticks that says $100 trillion on it, exchanged amongst corrupt bankers for fees to pay for these godforsaken overpriced hookers.
Well, in fact, we talked about the last episode of Keiser Report.
Watch the last episode of Keiser Report for the full story.
But it does fit in with this this banker, managing director at Stone & McCarthy in Princeton, New Jersey. Raymond Stone says, could the Fed go broke? The answer to this question was yes, but it is now no because of this accounting law.
Well, there's no, again, it's like,
hello, Ben. Hello, Tim. Hello, Ben. I'd like to do the deal. I have poopy.
that's all that they talk about in the high finance circles in America. It's a complete canard. It's basically a command and control. The dollar is the product of a Politburo called the Federal Open Market Committee, and they fixed the price. It's not supply and demand. It's not free market capitalism. It's freaking Soviet-era communism. And where do we report it? On this show, on RT. Think about it.
So speaking of Davos, super cycle leaves no economy behind before Davos summit. So all the big banks are back up in Davos, and they're celebrating. They're very optimistic this year. Apparently, the whole world's going to be rich by the end of the century, according to Edward Prescott, a senior monetary advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, who shared the 2004 Nobel Prize for Analysis of Business Cycles and Economic Policy.
Everyone's going to have $1 billion US, and the price of a cup of coffee will be $5 billion US.
HSBC Bank says by 2050, global output will have trebled, and average annual growth will accelerate towards 3% from 2% in the past decade.
That's absolutely correct. And the price of gold will be $500 million per ounce.
Yes, but they're saying output will actually treble. That means actual production of goods and services will treble. Where are these resources going to come from, one might ask?
Virtual goods. Just like you pointed out, the Federal Reserve is moving to a virtual currency model. There's no collateral. It's zero reserve banking. They're going to give everyone avatars to do commerce in cyberspace and award them billions of virtual dollars. And they'll count that as output. It's virtual output. That's what they failed to disclose in that piece. It's virtual output. It's not output like mining or manufacturing. It's virtual output of avatars having virtual sex and then raising the virtual babies and calling that a family and then applying that to some neoclassical model. It's hokum.
Some of the questions that have been asked of Ben Bernanke before Congress, and then recently Alan Greenspan was asked this too in several interviews, is the Fed going to be able to withdraw some of this money that they've been creating over the past year or two? How are they going to avoid inflation? And I was thinking maybe, in a way, the environment, the collapse of the environment around the world is a big sinkhole for all of this capital being created.
Absolutely.
2011, year of the flood. The year 2010 was one of the worst years in world history for high-impact floods. But just 3 weeks into the new year, 2011, has already had an entire year's worth of mega floods.
That's right. That's right. Environmental collapse is the deflation they need to offset the virtual inflation. Yeah. When a forest burns up, when a desertification kicks in China, it's no longer viable economically, and that's deflation. And they'll say, well, we needed that to offset our inflation. So at the end of the day, you end up with virtual avatars representing us living in a wasteland that's been burned down by ecological degradation caused by all that free money to begin with.
Well, in particular, so a lot of these Davos projections for the optimistic future count on China growing. And who is feeding China but Australia?
Who?
Australia.
Who's in town? Who's on first?
No, well, Australia is like their resources are going towards China to helping build China, from their uranium to coal to steel. Everything's going there, and they're supposedly in a symbiotic, nobody can lose relationship. Wage and inflation risk loom after Australia floods. So we've seen floods in Sri Lanka, Brazil, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Philippines, but none worse than Australia, where there's been over $30 billion worth of damage so far with the floods in Queensland and Victoria. And, this is part of the La Nina effect, of course, which is, every 3 to 5 years, this big La Nina effect happens. But on top of the climate change, which is 1 degree Celsius warmer waters off of Australia, has added 6 to 8% more moisture in the air, which is allowing all these floods to happen.
All right, so the ecological devastation is the necessary deflation to offset all the money printing. This might take the strain off the military budget, because up until recently, the traditional way to create artificial deflation is to go send 100,000 Marines somewhere, get them blown up for no reason other than to secure rights for Coca-Cola to be sold somewhere, and then claim that that's deflation to offset the money printing. So maybe this will mean more of the U.S. Marine Corps survives in this deflationary environment. Although, if I know the U.S., they'll figure out a way to kill more soldiers needlessly.
But Max, before I go, there's one final headline, a warning about Davos, because they're there to save the world and help us all, and the likes of Bono and Bill Gates are there. Headline, fraud plagues celebrity-backed global health fund. This is the health fund that's backed by Bono's Red, which he launched at Davos a few years ago, and Bill Gates, who's often up at Davos. And apparently $21.7 billion development fund backed by celebrities and hailed as an alternative to the bureaucracy of the United Nations sees as much as 2/3 of some of its grants eaten up by corruption. Much of the money is accounted for with forged documents or improper bookkeeping, which sounds like our whole global financial system in the West, and it looks like if they're going to save the world, this is all they'll ever deliver.
Well, Bono is an investment banker disguised as a rock and roll player. He aspires to steal money from people, like he has a private equity group, and they're involved in all kinds of nasty deals, and he doesn't do any aid benefit concert for Ireland. Well, how come he's not doing one? Hey, help Ireland. Well, oh no, that's right, it's a tax dodge for Ireland. He doesn't pay any taxes. Well, this guy's a schmuck, Bono. He's a total schmuck.
Well, I think that makes him a much better banker than he is a rock and roll player, as you call it.
He's a schmuck, Bono, and Edge too. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Speaking of gold and silver, much more coming your way, so don't go away. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Maryland to talk with money manager Michael Woody O'Brien, who also writes at financialsense.com, their website. Woody, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Max, it's great to be with you from a beautiful sunny day in Maryland. We're getting lots of free solar electricity on this beautiful day today.
Yeah, I hope we get some crab cakes as well. Now, we first saw you on the Big Dad 06 vlogcast, I should say, and so impressed by that, we decided to have you on the Keiser Report. Now, Woody O'Brien, the Tunisian president Ben Ali fled the country with 24% of the nation's gold supply. I thought gold was a barbarous relic. Why would he take all that gold and not paper money?
Well, of course, that's part of the great elite fraud, that gold is a barbaric relic and it's not an important monetary item. I think if you go back through history and read what the bankstocracy has really said about gold, no one got it better than J.P. Morgan, which has said is gold is money. and nothing else. And I would only say the only part of that that's wrong is silver is money too. Silver is got a very important place right alongside of gold. But I think the important thing to remember is it's a lot like the old Soviet Union, where the Russian people knew what the truth was by reading Pravda and assuming that it was the opposite. Because the fact is that we have a global financial system that is nothing more than a great looting machine to rob the people in a way that sends money from, in the case of America, it takes money from the farms and the factories in the heartland and ships it off to New York and Washington, where it can be manipulated in programs and derivative trading. And I think the thing that people are beginning to realize is that the manipulation isn't the answer. The manipulation is the cancer.
Right. Okay. So you're talking about financial propaganda versus political propaganda. And here we are in the 21st century. People are talking about currency wars. And with every war, there is propaganda. So with a currency war, you need financial propaganda. So just to roll through this again so people get a handle on it, in the U.S., the financial propaganda, for example, would indicate that the huge bailouts of the banks had nothing to do with the fact that they looted the economy and they destroyed the housing market and made huge bets against the collapse of the housing market, turbocharging their profits by making bets against the housing market, or in the case of Goldman Sachs, making direct bets against its own clients. But talk about, for a second now, I remember, to make this political financial propaganda comparison, to build on this a little bit, remember, in 1989, the solution for political propaganda was freedom. The Berlin Wall came down and freedom rang, and that was the solution for political propaganda. The solution for financial propaganda, the equivalent, you could say, is freedom in terms of a gold and silver standard backing currency. That is the equivalent of freedom, is it not, Woody?
Absolutely. And I would tell you, I think serious economic thinkers have to first acknowledge that the dollar's days are numbered. It's going to end up in the dustbin of history, and we need to start thinking about what's going to be the monetary system that comes next. My own preference is to have a basket of commodities that would include untaxed land that's owned by the U.S. government, because I think if you had just a gold standard or just a silver standard, it would be too easy to manipulate in the future by banksters who haven't been born yet. And I think the broadest way to do it is to have a currency that's going to be redeemable in lots of different things, redeemable in grain, redeemable in energy. But I think at the end of the day, where people need to be right now is they need to acknowledge there is no salvation for the dollar. People need to take steps now, including owning gold, including owning silver, including having storable food and water, to survive the collapse that's now unavoidable, and to start to think about what it is that comes next. Because we are in what my friend in Chicago, Ted Andros, likes to say, a currency extinction event. And if you look at, as I have, at the history of countries that have had these currency collapses, I think Zimbabwe is a good recent example. Everything devolves down to barter until there is some new currency regime that is put into place. And I think there are going to be a lot of hungry people in the United States that if they don't have silver and gold to barter for food, they're going to be involuntarily losing weight.
There's an interesting conundrum, if you will, out there. It's the inflation versus deflation debate. Economists don't appear to be able to decide whether the economy is suffering mostly from deflation caused by the implosion in house prices and all the bond paper associated and mortgage paper associated with that and all the huge bank write-offs that are associated with that, or whether we're experiencing, because of the increase in money, whether we are increasing inflation. And people point to, let's say, a rise in the price of gold and silver as evidence of inflation. But let me ask you this, because this is an interesting conundrum, and it follows up on exactly what you just said in terms of making gold, silver, and other commodities the basis for a new currency. Couldn't you make the statement that the economy is suffering from deflation, primarily in the form of collapse of a fiat currency system, and the rise of gold and silver and other commodities is not indicative of inflation necessarily, but more indicative of the fact that we are already on a gold standard?
I think given the amount of barter going around the world and, things that are being bought and sold using gold and silver now, I think you can say we have a shadow gold standard. But I think this larger question of inflation versus deflation, it's very, very complicated. In the U.S., there obviously is inflation in food and fuel and in metals prices, but there certainly is deflation in things like real estate. I think the big picture for people to grasp in this is that organic economics is naturally deflationary. If you look at things like, and I've written about this at GoldSeek, about eggs or cars or other kinds of basic commodities, even a bottle of Coca-Cola, you can buy far more goods now than you could 50 or 100 years ago if you're buying them with gold and silver, if you're buying them with real money. If you're buying them with paper or electronic fiat money, obviously there's been a great deal of inflation. So I think this whole question of inflation versus deflation really depends on the measuring stick it is that you're using. If you're using paper money, obviously the price of everything has soared. If you're using real money, the price of all things have fallen. But I think at the end of the day, the real problem is debt. If you look at these states and municipalities in the United States, they're the second biggest employer in the U.S., and they are all drowning in debt. I spent a lot of time in my earlier life in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I can tell you that's a city, and you've seen this in Europe and you've seen it in Iceland and Greece, where these governments are putting people into this false choice of, well, you must endure austerity, so the people who lent the money get 100 cents on the dollar. Now, I don't know about you, Max, but the last time I checked, when you lend someone money, you accept the risk that things will go wrong and they won't be able to pay. And this idea that cities in New Jersey or Pennsylvania or across the map ought to cut firemen and policemen and make people less safe in order that Goldman Sachs and other banksters get 100 cents on the dollar, this is beyond absurdity. If a person can't pay, they default. If a state can't pay, they should default. If a municipality can't pay, they should default. And at the end of the day, this is really the problem is we're having a progressive collapse of debt.
Right, and a collapse of debt, which is another word for that, is deflation. Now, and conversely, you can't really have inflation without rising wages, rising employment, rising interest rates, or a rising capacity utilization, none of which exist. So none of the signs of inflation are there. You have a rising commodity price level, but that is because the world is abandoning fiat currencies and moving toward a commodity-based reserve currency right now, no matter what the Fed does or doesn't do. That's what the world is adopting. They're saying no to fiat currencies. Now, you wrote a piece called Paper, Plastic, or Silver. That's the title of an article. Tell us about paper, plastic, or silver. What's this all about?
Paper, plastic, or silver was really about this idea that it's very, very possible in America to pay for things in silver, and all you have to do you're not going to be able to pay for silver at Walmart, but if you go to your local garage or local businesses, and ask, would you rather be paid in paper money, or would you rather be paid in silver? You'd be amazed how many people are willing now to transact business in 1 ounce silver coins.
This confirms what I'm saying, that there's already a gold and silver standard being utilized, and that's why the price is going up, not because of quote-unquote inflation.
Well, I think a big part of why you're seeing metals prices go up so dramatically is it is a fear trade. And I could tell you, I have clients who 10 years ago, I could have gotten out of cattle prod and I couldn't have gotten them to have any interest in owning a gold fund or owning an ounce of gold. And now they're constantly, asking, how is it that you do this? How do you convert, your dollars into getting physical possession of gold? I'm surprised how many kind of little old lady clients that I get to talk to have heard of buy silver crash JP Morgan. I think your efforts in that area are much more widespread among the population than any of us really know. But I think the question of whether these prices are going up because of fear leads to the question of, is the fear legitimate? And the answer is, just listen to Ben Bernanke. if when you hear this guy, it doesn't just scare the bejesus out of you, check your pulse. These people are always wrong. They're never telling the truth. And I have to tell you, it's going to be very interesting in the next couple of months to see if Ron Paul can muster up his inner hockey player and ask the kind of questions to Ben Bernanke that really need to be asked.
Well, up until now, it seems like he was lobbying for the job that he has now, and so his questions tended to be somewhat long and convoluted. Now that he's got this job, hopefully, yeah, he'll shorten the questions and he'll start to really go for the jugular. Now, of course, getting back to what you were saying about fear driving the price of these precious metals, in the case of silver and the campaign crashed JP Morgan buy silver, I think it also has to do with hate. There's so much hatred of these banks, particularly the JP Morgan, that folks think that they can exercise their hatred by buying silver, which they can. By removing 1 ounce of physical, it kills JP Morgan's balance sheet by $100 in phantom, illusory derivatives nonsense cooked up by Blythe Masters and other witch doctors back there on Wall Street. Of course, they're going to do it. All right, Michael Woody O'Brien, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Max, wonderful to be with you and the lovely Stacy. And anytime you need me again, I'm always available to you.
All righty, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Michael Woody O'Brien. Look him up on the web, check out his work, and a big thanks to Big Dad 06 for tipping us on Woody's work. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.